This is how a small family-owned business overcame fire, war, and total destruction in order to become one of the biggest guitar companies in the world, representing rock icons like Paul Gilbert, Steve Vai, Joe Satriani, and Polyphia. Let's talk about Ibanez guitars. The guitar market is over $9 billion in 2024, and Ibanez is considered the third biggest brand in the world, second only to Fender and Gibson. Ibanez Guitars has an incredibly interesting origin story that led them to where they are today. Ibanez is owned by Hoshino Gakki, originally called Hoshino Shoten, which actually started out as a bookstore, mostly selling textbooks. In 1908, Hoshino made the momentous decision of beginning to sell musical instruments along with textbooks. They primarily sold foot-powered organs to Japanese schools. In 1929, as the guitar became more popular around the world and in Japan, the company began importing guitars from Salvador Ibanez in Spain. That year, they also changed their name to Hoshino Gakki Ten. Hoshino was a family business through and through, with the owner Yoshitaro eventually getting all four of his sons involved in running the company. Despite the political upheaval and worsening economic conditions in Japan through the 1930s, the company continued to grow and began importing instruments from Germany, the US, Czechoslovakia, as well as Spain. Interestingly, they still struggled to keep up with demand, and in 1935, Hoshino began producing their own stringed instruments in Nagoya. It was then that they decided to drop both the Salvador and the tilde from the name, officially creating Ibanez. Salvador's guitars were known for their immense quality, with one even famously used by Eric Clapton. Salvador became an apprentice luthier when he was just 11 years old. Starting his workshop in 1883, he quickly grew it into Spain's largest guitar factory, but this would not last. The shop in Valencia, Spain was burned down during the Spanish Civil War. This sadly spelled the end of their guitar production, but the demand for their well-crafted classical guitars was as high as ever. It was then that Hoshino decided to purchase the rights to the name and began making both classical and acoustic guitars under the Ibanez name. First as Ibanez Salvador and eventually just Ibanez. By the late 30s, Ibanez had also begun exporting instruments to the US, and this was an incredibly prosperous time for them. This was until tragedy struck, first in 1939 when a fire destroyed the company's manufacturing facility. To make matters worse, the company was forced to create essential goods for the war effort rather than make non-essential musical instruments during World War II. And the cherry on top? All four of Yoshitaro's sons were forced into military service, forcing Ibanez to cease all operations. And if that wasn't enough, Allied bombers ended up leveling the plant completely. After the war, the family got back together and began rebuilding the business. By 1950, they'd completely resumed their domestic operations, but because the market had gotten so much more competitive, they realized they needed to look internationally. By 1955, the company had stopped all domestic operations to focus solely on foreign markets. Fun fact, one of the first items that Hoshino actually sold well internationally were picks, because Hoshino's picks were still made from tortoiseshell, while many competitors had already switched over to synthetic picks. In the late 50s, Hoshino was exporting a few other brand names like Imperial and Royal guitars, but by 1960, the company had made its clear focus of distribution Ibanez. In 1960, Junpei Hoshino, who had assumed leadership of the company when his brother passed, created Tama Seisakusho. They created their own factory and began making their own percussion and stringed instruments. This was again in response to a lack of supply and overwhelming demand. This continued until 1966, when the company decided to solely focus on manufacturing percussion instruments and decided to contract the manufacturing of stringed instruments to other companies. Note that there are Tama brand guitars, but they only got introduced after 1974, with the first ever Tama brand guitar being a 3558, a Dreadnought acoustic. This was made by Tama Seisakusho as well, in Aichi, Japan. Tama Seisakusho would later be renamed to Hoshino Gakki Manufacturing in 1981. From 1966 to today, Hoshino Gakki has been almost exclusively a wholesaler of stringed instruments rather than a manufacturer of them. By the late 60s, Hoshino's electric guitars were almost exclusively made by Fujigen, as well as Teisco until 1970, who had many of their employees move to Fujigen after their company went down. Fujigen has always had a close relationship with Ibanez and is incredibly well respected. Case in point, the Squires that were made at the Fujigen plant, mostly in the 80s, now command a much higher price than the Squires which were not. Through the 70s and 80s, the vast majority of Ibanez's guitars and basses were produced by the Fujigen factory. The acoustic guitar production remains more of a mystery, with Hoshino sourcing multiple guitar suppliers during that time. In the 1960s, many Japanese guitar companies, including Ibanez, were building guitars that looked a lot like Italian-based Echo guitars, as well as Swedish-based Hagström guitars. With the birth of rock and roll in the 1950s, led by pioneers such as Chuck Berry, the 1960s have been described by many as the single most important decade for rock and roll, with artists like the Rolling Stones, the Beatles, Jimi Hendrix, and Bob Dylan all coming onto the scene. As such, there was an incredible demand for guitars, a demand that far outweighed the supply. Harry Rosenblum was a man that rose up to meet this challenge, opening the music store Medley Music in 1954. By the late 50s, business was booming, but inventory was not. The store was only 70 miles from the Marcin Guitar Factory in Nazareth, Pennsylvania, but the waiting list to get a Martin guitar was 3 years. So in 1959, Rosenblum took matters into his own hands. He founded Elgar Guitars and hired a team led by Karl Muller, a German master violin maker. Harry and his team began making handmade American guitars, aiming to be a cheaper but quality alternative to Martin. The guitars sold fairly well, but after a few years, Harry found himself shifting his focus. His profitability was suffering, and he realized that Japanese-made guitars were much cheaper to make, yet still well made enough to sell in the American market. Harry would sign a deal in 1965 for Elgar Guitars to become the exclusive North American distributor of guitars for Hoshino, selling Ibanez guitars. Heading into the late 60s and early 70s, this was prime time for Japanese instruments to enter the US market. The perception back then, and even now, is that the Fender and Gibson guitars of the 70s are a dark period. Famously, Fender was bought by CBS in 1965 and Gibson by Norlin in 1969. CBS-era Fender is often associated with extreme cost cutting, using cheaper parts, finishes, and having less consistency. Norlin-era Gibsons were very quirky. Some came with 3-piece maple necks, instead of the mahogany necks that Gibson had been so known for. Some had insanely low, flat frets that came to be known as the fretless wonder. Some changes people did like, such as the volute. Some of these guitars were extremely heavy, at times over 12 pounds. While there were definite mixed reactions, the fact remains that the 70s guitars could not live up to the reputation of the 50s and 60s. To add further headache, American guitar prices were rising, and higher than ever. This proved timely for Ibanez. Hoshino had purchased Elgar Guitars and regained their North American distribution rights. They continued distributing Japanese-made guitars in the US, which now seemed more attractive to American consumers who were dealing with inflation. In the early 70s, many Japanese makers started coming out with guitars that looked eerily similar to some American ones. For Ibanez, the 3 brands that they looked to the most were Rickenbacker, Fender, and Gibson. The story goes that in the early 70s, these guitars looked similar, but could not match up in quality, with some people citing the use of plywood and the use of bolt-on necks on Gibson-style guitars instead of set necks, among other factors. However, by the mid-70s, the quality of these guitars was often said to be on par, if not better than some of the CBS-era Fender and Norlin-era Gibson guitars, but that would very soon come to a dramatic close. On June 28, 1977, Norlin files a lawsuit against Hoshino-owned Elgar Guitars. They took issue with the headstock of Ibanez's super standard Les Paul model. There were many things about that guitar that made it look almost identical to a Gibson Les Paul, but Norlin's issue was mainly about the open book headstock design that Gibson was famous for. It was a headstock that was featured on all Gibson models at the time. Norlin tried to sue Elgar for more than $6 million, but the case ended up being settled out of court. The funny thing is, Hoshino already knew this was coming, so by the time Norlin tried to file the lawsuit, the headstock had already been changed. There were a few other lawsuit threats and cease and desists, including what was essentially an angry letter from Marcin to Takamine. But this Ibanez case was by far the most notorious and brought about the terms lawsuit guitar and lawsuit era. After the lawsuit, Ibanez decided to change the way they handled things. They would make everything their own and not run the risk of getting sued again. By 1977, Ibanez had stopped all copy guitar production. They had already begun making original guitars a few years prior, most notably with the Artist Series guitars and basses that they first introduced in 1974. With the help of their original designs and superb craftsmanship, Ibanez turned heads by acquiring Bob Weir of the Grateful Dead as their first ever signature artist. These signature guitars were made by Fujigen. Featuring an ash body with set-in maple neck, Ibanez's very own Super 70 humbucking pickups, and Tune-o-matic style bridge with stop tailpiece. Interestingly, Bob also had a prototype guitar with a sliding middle pickup that could move up or down the guitar, changing the sound. Weir eventually found a spot to fix the middle pickup, as we can see on his Cowboy Fancy guitar. Ibanez's second signature artist was none other than the jazz great himself, George Benson. The Ibanez GB10 is the longest running production model Ibanez has ever had. Ibanez were the ones who first approached George, then won him over with their people skills and incredible hollow body guitar workmanship. Ibanez had another huge win when the frontman of Kiss, Paul Stanley, signed on for his signature model. Oddly enough, it went by two names, the PS10 and the IC1000. It was heavily based on the Ibanez Iceman. Ibanez continued to sign artists from the English-speaking world, and exploring their options in the post-lawsuit era. 1979 proved significant with the release of the Roadster, Ibanez's first attempt at a Strat-style guitar that wasn't a copy. The Roadster was followed up by the more affordable and stripped-down version, the Ibanez Blazer, just 1 year later in 1980. In 1983, the Roadstar 2 was introduced, and is the predecessor to one of Ibanez's most popular models ever. There was just one problem. These guitars were not selling. With bands like Metallica and Megadeth forming in the early 80s, hard rock and metal were bigger than ever heading into the mid-80s. This period proved extremely difficult for Ibanez, with Mike Shimada even saying that Ibanez almost went out of business in 1985 and 86. This, he said, was for two main reasons. The first reason was that the Japanese yen skyrocketed, making Japanese guitars much more expensive overseas. The second reason was that because post-lawsuit Ibanez was so intent on making everything themselves, they struggled to make a tremolo system that would rival Floyd Rose's. They created several trems, including the Hard Rocker and Pro Rocker, but in Mike's words, they felt that Floyd Rose had made the perfect tremolo. What's more, in 1977, Eddie Van Halen's Frankenstrat famously launched the beginning of the Superstrat era. It used one of the earliest Floyd Roses, and with the addition of Eddie's feedback, the Floyd Rose design quickly evolved into the design that's still so prominent today. Shimada also noted that Les Paul style guitars were much easier for Ibanez to make their own versions of, while Stratocaster type guitars offered far fewer options. These factors all led to Ibanez's struggle to stand out with their Stratocaster type guitars, which put them in very dangerous financial waters. They were able to release a few signature guitars with some very impressive artists, but it was this next relationship that would turn it all around and leave its mark on the legacy of Ibanez forever.
The limitations of the Strat and the Les Paul were 22 frets. I like 24 frets. However many frets you have, these guitars were never made so you could actually reach them comfortably. It was really hard to find guitars that had 24 frets and a whammy bar and humbuckers and a single coil. I went to this little shop in Hollywood. We got some bodies, reshaped the body a bit, put some angles in it, put a 24 fret neck, and made it so that you can actually reach up there and play.
Back in 1986 December, Shino USA had sent one special guitar as a Christmas gift. The very eccentric Maxus finished with green snake skin. This was suggested by Steve Brucia of DiMarzio Pickup Company. A few weeks later, Steve Brucia called me. He said Steve is very interested in working. He proposed to send the guitar he has been using. He was on the tour with David Lee Roth.
We received 2 guitars from Steve, maybe one, at least one.
Very shortly after that, Ibanez had sent me this gem. Not this one in particular, but this one. It had the perfect pickup configuration. The volume pot was moved. It had the one tone. They came up with this claw. Thought I'd wanted to do at least one thing that no one would ever copy because it would be just too blatant.
Rich has said, no, don't do the slot. He wants it to be more like a hand grip. Just think hand grip. Little individual slots, so each finger will go through it.
And in the beginning, I remember they said, well, we'd like to make this guitar a production model. And I thought, well, I don't know, because it's nice for me. It's kind of weird, it's got a monkey grip and all this stuff. They said, well, we think it could do well.
Summer NAMM Show, 1987.
The thing that was going through my head is, how do all these people know me? It would take literally a half an hour to walk 10 feet.
That special stand was situated in middle of Ibanez guitar booth, and we put the black cover. It says this will be unveiled noon the second day. Unveil day happened, and it was really overwhelming. Some of us really hugged each other, and some guy really crying. It was a really sensational debut.
無料の雑誌のどっか裏表紙かどっかにヘッドが少しずつ土曜日の午後かすごい人いっぱい来てて、でスティーブ・ワイがバーッと入ってきてカーテンボーンと取って、これが俺のモデルだぜみたいな。だからあと残りの2日間はもうずっとスティーブ・ワイの話題だけで終わっちゃったようなショーでしたね。いや、イバニーズってやっぱりジェムかっていう感じですかね。
Needless to say, the release of the Gem in 1987 reinvigorated life into the brand. The Gem also inspired the creation of the Ibanez RG line, the first of which appeared in 1987 as the RG 550, which was largely based on the Gem, having the same dimensions, woods, and Floyd Rose style bridge, but with American-designed Ibanez pickups rather than Steve's DiMarzio pickups in the Gem. Shimada also cited the super thin 19mm wide neck as evolving from Ibanez wanting to beat the competition, with Charvel making a 19.5mm neck. The RG 550 debuted under the Roadstar Deluxe name, but eventually got its own line in the RG series from 1992 onwards, with RG standing for Roadstar Guitar. The RG body style, much like a Stratocaster's but with pointier horns, sharper edges, and a smaller body, has become what many people think of when they think of the word Super Strat. To this day, it remains one of Ibanez's best-selling and most beloved guitars. It's become a classic in its own right, that rivals the Stratocaster, Telecaster, Gibson Les Paul, and PRS Custom 24. The Roadstar Pro Line series also debuted in 1987 and featured the important guitar models S for Sabre and R for Radius. Future guitar legend Joe Satriani was a fan of the Radius, which introduced with it the tilt neck joint, which also came on the early RGs. Interestingly, this was different than the neck heel Steve Vai had used on the Gem. At the time, some knew Satriani for being Steve Vai's teacher, but it was his hit record Surfing with the Alien in 1987 that burst him onto the scene. His star quickly on the rise, it was reportedly thanks to the efforts of DiMarzio and the fact that Vai had already signed with Ibanez that Joe began talks with them. In 1987, Joe became an endorser for Ibanez, and after 3 years of tweaking a design, the modified Ibanez Radius model became the basis for Joe's signature guitar in 1990, the JS1, 2, and 3. The Radius shape was discontinued in 1994, but it lives on in Joe's signature series, which is the only current model based on the Ibanez Radius shape, while on the other hand, over 200 models of the Sabre aka S shape have been produced. While Ibanez did have a few incredible world-class players during these years on their roster, some would say that there were 3 main guitarists that took their name and their reputation to superstardom in the late 80s. One of these, of course, was Steve Vai, and another Joe Satriani. The third was a man who became an instructor at the prestigious Musicians Institute at just age 19, and exploded onto the scene with bands Racer X in 1985 and Mr. Big in 1987. This, of course, was Paul Gilbert. Gilbert was born in 1966, but already was approached by many industry titans by the mid-80s. They recognized his skill and wanted him to play their guitars and become an endorser. This included Wayne Charvel, who by then was building guitars independently, as well as BC Rich and Hamer. Paul loved the look of BC Rich guitars, especially the Mockingbird, but after playing them briefly, found them uncomfortable, and Wayne eventually moved to working for Gibson. Ibanez was dependable, easy to work with, and more importantly, willing to listen to new ideas. Much like Steve Vai, the idea of dreaming up something new got Paul excited. Paul was actually familiar with Ibanez. The Ibanez Destroyer was the first electric guitar Gilbert ever played. It belonged to his guitar hero and uncle, musician Jimmy Kidd. Ibanez and Paul began their relationship in 1986. They made Paul a handful of very eye-catching custom guitars. Paul would show these guitars off on tour, on promotional materials like band photos and magazines, and on his famous instructional videos, including Intense Rock. The funny thing is, Paul would often be demoing gear in music stores, and he found that he preferred playing the stock RG models over his custom guitars. So in 1989, after a few years of tinkering and using the RG 770 model as the base, Ibanez unveiled the PGM 100, Paul's first signature guitar. This model has become iconic for its painted F-holes. Much like Satriani and Vi, Gilbert has released numerous signatures with Ibanez through the years, including the Fireman, which was his twist on an Ibanez Iceman. In 1990, Ibanez would again shock the guitar world by releasing the first ever commercially available 7-string guitar. This was the Ibanez universe, and it started a movement, with many players in the limelight picking it up. Today, 30 plus years later, 7-string guitars are highly sought out and extremely popular. 1987 to 1992 would be a golden age for Ibanez's growth, including the number of collaborations they had with incredible artists during this era. The decades that followed saw Ibanez cement their reputation as a brand that prioritized quality, innovation, and embracing rock, metal, and heavier genres. In recent years, they've made strides by having Nita Strauss as their first ever female signature artist, and by signing artists such as Ichika, as well as Yvette Young, who both have signature guitars inspired by the cult classic Tallman series, Tim Henson and Scott Lepage, both from the band Polyphia, and Marcin. Ibanez's roster contains some of the most unique and virtuosic players of this generation. Over 100 years since its humble beginnings and now a giant of the industry themselves, with enormous presence in both the electric and acoustic guitar markets, now it seems that Ibanez is trying to cater to a wider range of players. What do you find interesting about Ibanez guitars?